Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Murray McLean, Chair of the Australia-Japan Foundation, and just saying that because we are a sponsor and have supported the Japan Update since its inception a number of years ago now. And I must say that the Japan Updates are a very key part of our reason to exist, because we like to support dynamic activities that help foster understanding and knowledge between Australia and Japan, and the Japan Update does that brilliantly. So thank you very much for once again inviting me to your conference. It's a great pleasure today for me to introduce as a political keynote speaker, Professor Fujiwara Kiichi, who's a Professor of International Politics and Director of the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. He has many, many hats, as we were discussing over lunch. He obviously has excellent English, having studied in the United States as a Fulbright Scholar at Yale, and he's spent a great deal of time at various universities, but also as an author, a highly published author of a number of works relating to geopolitics and our regional and global interests. He writes a weekly film review for the Mainichi, which he tells me is really what he does most of the time, is sit around watching films to review. I'm sure that's a very modest disclaimer, because he is clearly also extremely well known as a highly stimulating and authoritative commentator on Japanese politics, Japanese foreign policy, strategic issues, and I look forward very much to hearing from him today, not just in this keynote speech, but also as part of the panel that will follow this. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kiichi.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador McLean, for your kind words, which is a bit too generous, I should say. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me to the 2019 Japan Update. I always treasure opportunities to visit Australia. First, of course, because there's a great number of excellent scholars and practitioners in Canberra. And more importantly, should I say, this is a hub, a place where, well, scholars from very different regions, sometimes with very different views to each other, can be engaged in constructive discussion. And I recall my visit in 2004, when we had the extremely difficult relationship between Japan and China, related to history issue, Japanese wartime responsibility, and the Yasukuni Shrine. And well, there was many meetings that I had attended in Tokyo, or for that matter, Washington. But the one I had here with Chinese, Korean, American, and Australian scholars was the best, really. And somehow, you know, in Australia, we can be friends. And that must have something to do with this attention to multilateralism in a very sincere way, and not as a political token. So I shouldn't take too much time thanking Australia, but thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this meeting. Now, we have a puzzle here. Prime Minister Abe is about to become the longest-standing prime minister in Japanese history. He's, well, it's not that long, really, compared to other nations. But I should say that Australia has become more democratic than we are. We took pride in choosing one prime minister each year. But then that is not the case right now. And Abe is the strongest prime minister since Koizumi or Nakasone, not only in Kenya, but also on his grip over the executive and also on his control over the parliament. I'm not praising him, it's just a statement of fact. And at the same time, Prime Minister Abe has not been so successful as it might seem when it comes to foreign policy. Take a look at his record of his attempted negotiation with Russia over a new treaty and that would restore Japanese sovereignty to what the Japanese call Hokkaido or the Korea Islands, and the repeated negotiations, both at the foreign minister level and also at the level of Vladimir Putin and Abe Shinzo, and they met several times. It came out with nothing. Really, we do not see any results at all. You take a look at Japan's relationship with the United States, and this is something I will be discussing later on. But right now, an even more important issue is this conflict with ROK, the South Korean government. This I would not discuss here, although this would be a topic down there, I believe. And I don't really understand what's going on. But what it shows is that the foreign policy making mechanism in Japan has changed quite abruptly. This is something I'll come back at the later part of my talk in the issue of Kante Gaiko. So the puzzle here is that you have a very strong prime minister, a very strong administration, in fact, possibly the strongest in the post-war years, and he has been surviving failures, if I may, in foreign policy. So this is a puzzle to me. And Abe bashing is an intellectual's habit in some ways, but that's not the purpose here. I want to understand, and I want to think with you. Now, the topic here is, embracing Trump. This is a pretty strong choice of words. But as a matter of fact, Mr. Abe has been embracing Mr. Trump. Just take a look at the series of summits. There has been many summits, but even before Mr. Trump became the President of the United States, Prime Minister Abe visited New York, exchanged gifts, golf-related gifts, and that most certainly developed a personal relationship. And then on January, that's only 2 months after the New York meeting, and Abe was invited to Mar-a-Lago, the Florida house, and where they played 2 rounds of golf, and that gave a sort of a platform for, that was a preview for things to come. The G7 summit in 2017 was a glorious moment for Abe because, in essence, Trump was isolated. You have Trump here and you have others. Now, the only person who could talk to both was Prime Minister Abe. So this was a fantastic moment for the Japanese Prime Minister, working as a linchpin that brings European Union nations together with the United States. And then you see a whole series of summits, 3 summits in a year in 2018. That's a record, really. And then in 2019, this year, May, Mr. Trump visited Japan and watched sumo in a very serious matter. And he brought a chair to the Kokugikan, this small tournament auditorium. It's not supposed to be done, but of course, it's being Mr. Trump, he could do that. And then Trump attends G20 Osaka summit. This is one of the strongest personal connection between the Japanese Prime Minister and the President of the United States. Just take a look at the origin of embrace, and it's quite obvious. The Japanese foreign policy always paid attention to our relationship with the United States. U.S.-Japan relations is of paramount importance for Japan. When it comes to policy matters, you have alliance and you have trade. On alliance, we depend on U.S. capabilities. So for obvious reason, a stable relationship between the U.S. and Japan is critical. When it comes to trade, and again, U.S.-Japan relationship has always been rocked by trade disputes. So managing a good and stable institutional framework that support bilateral trade, if not multilateral trade, is essential. So trade alliance makes U.S. obviously important to Japan. Not only that, U.S. president works as a political asset. A prime minister who has strong ties with the United States U.S. president has an extreme influence in Japanese politics, for the simple reason being that he has the backing of the U.S. government. You can take a look at, say, for example, Prime Minister Nakasone, who used his relationship with President Reagan to a maximum degree. He had a personal tie with President Reagan, and that worked to his benefit. Or Nakasone, or Koizumi. Koizumi also was successful in building a strong relationship with President Bush, and that worked as a political asset for Prime Minister Koizumi. So personal confidence here is, goes a long way. Another factor is that President Trump is totally unpredictable. He's a newcomer, and he had a little connection to formal diplomatic networks. So, well, how can you work with Mr. Trump? The first thing that Abe did was to embrace Trump, develop personal relationship, and develop an asset that can work to his benefit. So far, so good. It's quite understandable. And this was also a preemptive embrace. There was a fear that President Trump, the newcomer, might be tough on Japan, both in trade and alliance. There was a fear that Trump might, rock the alliance between U.S. and Japan, demand higher host nation support. When it comes to trade, Trump not only criticized China, but also criticized Japan. That Japan is a free rider of trade. I think he was working on an image of the 1970s, and it gives me some sad satisfaction to see a U.S. president praising Japan as if it is a major economic power. But nonetheless, Trump can go in many directions, unpredictable. So to prevent stronger reaction against Japanese policy, embracing Trump became a necessity. And there was another issue, of course, and that is China. Basically, there are three rivalries of China between Japan and China. One, of course, is territorial disputes and maritime safety. It's quite obvious, so I don't really think I have to inform you about that, but there's a territorial dispute in Senkaku Jayudai, and Chinese naval powers have been pretty active in the neighborhood, which alarmed the Japanese, of course. And in a more general sense, there was this attention to geopolitical rivalries. For China is not only expanding in East or South China Sea, and China is now a major military power that has moved out of to the blue waters. So One Belt, One Road could be interpreted in geopolitical terms. How can we cope with a rising power that is China? That was a major concern. I should also add an economic rivalry. One thing that, well, I think I'll have time to discuss about later on is that we see a revival of what I have called economic diplomacy in Japan. In more cruel terms, it was called checkbook diplomacy. Using ODAs, official development dates, as a key tool for Japanese foreign policy. Now, this is a policy that has become, well, strongly recognized in late 1970s to 1980s, all throughout 1990s, I should say, but somehow went away, partially because of Japanese economic demise. And the other reason being that Japan accommodated global standards on development days and stopped using checks for political purposes. This has changed. Take a look at the recent international conference, development conference on Africa that took place late August in Yokohama. Abe, of course, delivered a speech. This was a key important moment for Japanese policy. But why Africa? Well, one reason would be to win support for nominating Japan for the standing member of the Security Council. That's a long shot, to say the least, but that is, of course, there. A more important reason is China. China's economic influence in Africa alarmed the Abe administration, and suddenly Africa became important. I'm only talking about Africa, and there's quite a bit of things that I can discuss here, but we can argue that we see a revival of economic diplomacy that we had observed up until the end of the Obuchi cabinet, Obuchi administration. So it's been quite some time, and that's because of China. Now, Abe administration has been quite assertive in putting Japan back on the chessboard. The idea was that China is a rising power and Japan is neglected, Japan is being passed over, so putting Japan back in the regional chessboard became so important. To do that, Japan not only approached the United States but also ASEAN, Australia, as key partners. Abe has visited all ASEAN nations twice. Never happened before. This key attention to Southeast Asia is something that we have not observed for more than 30 years. And that is, of course, because of China. And Australia is a key partner in this regard. It also served a domestic purpose. Well, this was about making Japan great again. To restore confidence in Japan. I hope it's not unilateralism like Mr. Trump, but Mr. Abe's keen attention to put Japan back on the global chessboard had the domestic importance as well. And then, and I should rush here, this leads to a hope for a tougher America. I'll be very quick here, but there was disappointment or dismay about Obama administration's approach to China. There was frustration about the engagement policy, which essentially allowed China to become much stronger and much more of a challenger in the region. And also, the other point is that the geopolitical aspect of Obama administration's policy was quite volatile. The air-sea battle idea did not really come out with a coherent strategy, and that invited frustration from Tokyo. Now, so Tokyo doesn't want to fight China. In fact, Tokyo cannot fight China. What Tokyo wants is a tough US to push China away somehow. And that led to what I consider to be a mistaken expectation of President Trump. President Trump might be unpredictable. In fact, he might be only a newcomer to foreign policy. But so long as he's tough against China, well, isn't that a great chance for Japan? The initial 2 years was all spent on mobilizing U.S. influence over China for Japan's political interests, and I'll tell you later on that has changed over time. In 2018, there was a summit meeting in October. And in 2018 summit with Xi Jinping and Abe Shinzo, oh boy, something totally different took place. We see a new rapprochement between Beijing and Tokyo. Well, how's that? Coming back to this mistaken focus on Trump as a tougher U.S. against China, the embrace did not really work. We have to admit that there is a strong personal tie between the two leaders. I'm going to skip the details because they're too juicy. However, when it comes to policy consequences, it does not really work. When it comes to trade, the Trump administration has been tough to both China and Japan. And also, when it comes to alliance management, a good personal relationship with President Trump did not bring about a more nuanced view on host nation support. In fact, the opposite is the case. We believe that the U.S. demands for host nation support is much higher than has been accepted. Originally, it was supposed to be twice as much, but there are reports that Washington is asking to Japan to pay 4 times more. That's a ridiculous figure, and we're not taking this seriously. But nonetheless, when it comes to the Trump administration, you have to take everything seriously. And furthermore, when it comes to China, there is a different policy preference. Japan is more afraid about China as a military power. Japan also is afraid about China as an economic power, to be sure, but to push China by economic means can disrupt the global market. On the other hand, the Trump administration has focused on the economy first and geopolitics second. In fact, it will not be too much to say that the military strategy from the Trump administration toward China has been actually less consistent, even compared to the Obama administration. In the Obama administration, there was a strong focus on geopolitics, which is not the case right now. The focus is on trade. So that led to the confusion that we see now. I'm really running out of time, so I have to skip a couple of slides. U.S.-China trade wars. Right now, we are working in this direction. We were in a stalemate. A temporarily halt to tariff war could be expected, but the threat of retaliatory tariff will continue. But geopolitics and trade would be relatively independent. That was where we were. That was a probable scenario. The great scenario, the agreement, comprehensive agreement, including structural adjustment, is not going to happen anyway. We're moving into this direction, a stalemate to a new Cold War. I do not want to use the word Cold War yet. And if we want to apply the word Cold War, this is more closer to the period before the Korean War, 1949 to 1950, where the strategic situation was much more volatile between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's not a Cold War yet. However, we are moving in this direction. And that led to the October summit. This was essentially about risk management. This was how Japan and China could somehow hedge the risk that comes from the trade policy from the Trump administration. and that much has been reported quite widely. But I should also add that this was the first time that we see collaboration on defense policy between China and Japan, which we have not seen for quite some time. We now have an air-sea communication mechanism, a search and rescue agreement, and of course we have high-level defense talks, defense dialogues as well. This is a meeting where the expectation was high on the Tokyo side, but not on the Chinese side. And after the meeting, Prime Minister Abe stated that the two nations agreed on three principles: from competition to cooperation, partners not threats, development of free and just trade regime. Apparently, these three principles were prepared by the Japanese cabinet, but was not agreed with the Chinese government. So the statement was quickly withdrawn. Just to make sure, the Prime Minister said this in a press conference, and that we now agree on three principles, and then that was taken away. Doesn't happen like this. Japanese diplomacy is such a boring place, so predictable. All the papers come out before the meetings, before bullet points of the Xi Jinping Abe summit, before was available to the press before that meeting, which actually invited anger from Beijing. It's just the opposite side. How did this happen? I would say that this is related to a new kind of diplomacy that is taking place in Japan, and that is Kante Gaiku. I only have 2 minutes, so I have to be very brief. This essentially is a top-down approach in diplomacy. The role of the Prime Minister in foreign policy was extremely limited. The actor in foreign policy making was essentially the Minister of Foreign Affairs, with little initiative coming from the Prime Minister. This has changed almost totally. Policy making under the Abe administration, we have the Cabinet Bureau of Personal Affairs, newly installed, which actually means that the Cabinet Secretariat would be in a position to choose key leaders in each ministries. And I cannot tell you how important this is to destroy the integrity of individual ministries. For the simple reason being that now the bureaucrats have to watch what Kante or the Cabinet Office wants to do, or they might be sacked. And furthermore, you see the National Security Council under Yachi Shotaro, and Yachi, along with Kanehara, and is now the key architects of Japanese foreign policy, but not the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then there is another issue, the Prime Secretary, Hishokan, as it's called. When it comes to Hishokan, the inner clique of the Abe administration, we see a strong influence from METI, Ministry of External Trade and Industry. You might have heard about Imai Takaya, who is very possibly the second most important person in Japanese politics today, because Imai Takaya is the one who's running the show, really. And he is not only from METI, he has openly stated to the press that foreign policy coming from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is obsolete. Whoops, but that is what he said. There are limits to counter diplomacy. Well, there are merits, of course, and this top-down approach brings more integrity and more leadership for Japanese foreign policy. It puts a face on the Japanese government, and that's good. It also allows for flexibility. If there's anything about Japanese foreign policy, it is always inflexible. But when it comes with strong leadership from the Prime Minister, you can change policy quite abruptly. And that's what we saw in the change of policy toward China from 2016 to 2018 especially. But there are limits. One is demise of professionalism. with all my disrespect for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where many of my former students work, that's why they fail, right? They're professionals. They do have good information about foreign relations. They also have information about how the other side works. This is something that is conspicuously absent in Abe administration's approach to Russia and Abe administration's approach to South Korea. It is working on the wishful thinking that the strong leadership from the Prime Minister would break the barrier and achieve great achievements. Russia, this was essentially about money, about, well, not ODAs, about investment. When it comes to South Korea, money in the reverse case, in the opposite direction. You give money to Russia and you buy back the islands, essentially. You disagree with South Korea and then use the economy. The focus is on economic diplomacy or the lack of it. But this is not a professional approach to foreign policy. For many of the Russian experts' voices or South Korean experts' voices has been silenced in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that leads to a string of policy failures, if I may, Japan-Russia relations, trade negotiation with the US, and Mr. Trump being treated with a small tournament, and all the hospitality had the nerve, excuse my language, to argue about increasing tariff on Japan. And Abe's initiative on Iran is so painful that I don't really want to talk about. But I'm not laughing about this, really, because there was a serious serious conflict between Iran and the United States, and Tokyo working in between is not a wrong policy at all. What is wrong was that it lacked all the procedures, all the negotiations with Iran, all the negotiations with the United States. The professionals were kept out, the cabinet secretaries were in, and well, that's where we are. I'm over 33 minutes, I'm very sorry. Now, the nice thing about the keynote speech is that we have a panel discussion later on, so I'm only leaving this podium by addressing key questions instead of answering them. One, do we see a stable alliance or do we see decoupling? The possibility of decoupling is very much there with US unilateralism and also US and global retreat. But it's not clear yet. This is not yet the stage like President Nixon's statement in Guam, which essentially was about pulling out US influence from the Asian region. We haven't reached that stage yet. We might. This would be an important issue. Future of Japan PRC rapprochement. The 2018 summit went well, but nonetheless, can this kind of relationship be sustained between China and Japan? I find it highly doubtful because there's really no institutional basis for the agreement. It's just a collection of ad hoc agreements. Will Kante diplomacy survive after Abe? After all, is this not only is this not just a case of a long-standing prime minister with a long tenure? Nakasone, Koizumi, Abe, you stay long in office and you have a stronger Kante. That may be so. But like I said, there are also institutional changes that took place in Japan. So whether this Kante Gaiko, Kante diplomacy can be sustained is an open question. And I'm not only asking the fourth question because Professor Peter Drysdale is here. Does multilateralism have a future? I don't want to be cynical about this because I do believe that we do need multilateralism. But nonetheless, I would be foolish to deny that multilateral institutions have become endangered species. So we have to address that question. And the final question is, which is more dangerous, US or China? Abe administration started from the assumption that China is more dangerous than the United States, and have come to realize that the United States can be as unpredictable and as challenging as China. That decision is still yet to be made, but that's the milieu that we find ourselves today in Japan. Thank you for your attention.
Sorry, 6 minutes.
No, Kiichi, thank you. I think everyone probably wanted you to keep talking for another hour.
No, well, I left out Korea and
Okay, thanks.
yes.
Got to cover it.
A special favour to Lauren. Well, welcome everyone to the Politics and Foreign Policy panel. I think you probably, most of you already know who is sitting here in front of you. We have Professor Pamela Jane from the University of Adelaide. We have Lauren Richardson from our very own ANU. We have Rumi Aoyama-san from Waseda, and of course our keynote speaker. And I hail from across the Nullarbor, Perth at Murdoch University. Let's get started. We're not going to dive into CVs, we're going to dive into policy and politics. And we might be here till midnight because it's really interesting stuff. I'd like to start with a couple of observations. You know, the theme of our conference here today is about leadership in an age of uncertainty. And I think that's great. You read it everywhere, it rolls off the tongue. A few people seem to have a problem with it, except last week when I met Malcolm Cook in Singapore. And he said, I'm tired of hearing this talk about uncertainty. We are becoming more and more certain every day, she said, verbally, Malcolm, about how China is going to behave and what we may or may not expect from the United States. We have more certainty about what that looks like than arguably we had before the advent of the Trump administration, arguably before 2016, if we're talking about China in particular. So we might play with that idea. Recently, Peter Varghese, in a speech, referred to the liberal international order as being on life support. That's quite a dramatic thing to say. There's no question that we're in an era of strategic transition and we are moving away from what we can comfortably understand as a liberal international order, and we're moving towards something else. And we probably know also that it's not just about strategic accommodation of a rising power, it's about disrupting or even dismantling that order. And we are moving towards something else. And the question is, well, what is that something else going to look like? That's where leadership comes in. Who is going to shape it? Who is going to influence it? How is strategic competition going to create or challenge any new emerging order? So it's within that framework that I'd like to talk to the panelists today. And I think we need to start, Panendra, with the domestic political scene. There have been some elections, and I'm really interested in hearing from you. What do you think those elections tell us about where Japanese politics and the electoral cycle is heading? what are the outcomes of those elections that you think we ought to take note of?
Okay, thanks very much. I just want to open with a statement that this year, 2019, has been a very interesting year for Japan in political terms, because there have been some political events and they take place once in decades. One, I'm referring to the accession of the new emperor to the throne. 30 years since Heisei 1989, so we have got a new emperor this year, right? And 2019 is the year of the boar. And this is especially significant for politics in Japan. Why it is significant for politics in Japan? That in this year of the boar, the unified local elections and the upper house elections happen in a 2 months difference time. So this year we had the unified local elections in Japan in April, and then the upper house elections in July. And going back, in 2007, the last year of the board election, the LDP performed, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is the ruling party of Japan, it performed very badly in 2007. And Abe was the prime minister then. And he went to India in August after the election and gave a very impressive, often quoted talk to the Indian Parliament called the Confluence of the Two Seas,
Yes.
which is kind of, it turned into Indo-Pacific and free and open Indo-Pacific. But my point is that in 2007, as soon as Abe returned from India, he resigned his position because of immense pressure on him because of the poor performance of the LDP. So he resigned. Now 2019, let's talk about 2019, completely reverse. Abe is still the prime minister, second time prime minister in Japan. Unified local elections, the LDP and its partners, they did quite well in the unified local elections, and they did well at the upper house elections because Abe had set a low bar for the LDP and his coalition partner, the Komeito. So they performed much above what Abe had set as the bar for as to how many seats the LDP should get. So that brings Abe into a stronger position compared to 2007. At the same time, before these upper house elections, the LDP had supermajority, as they call it, that is the 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament. And that means that if the government wants to propose an amendment in the Constitution, they can do that. But in this upper house election, Abe lost his supermajority in the upper house. And that, what does that mean? Because I think Abe's dream project, or maybe one of the two dream projects, is to change the Constitution. So that dream project of Abe has kind of has gone a bit backward, or maybe he may not be able to realize, but he still insists that he would do that. So that's the political side of the comment, but also just a little bit, is it okay okay,
Sure.
Maybe I will stop there and come back later.
Well, no.
Okay.
Keep going. And I'm hoping.
Well, so what does this particular 2019 elections mean? The upper house elections do not attract international media or, even in Australia, we didn't hear much about it. But this is a very important election, and this year was very important. And this takes me back to the LDP rule for a very, very long period of time. So in 1989, at the time when the Heisei emperor came to the throne, the LDP was a very weak political party, almost on the verge of losing its majority. But somehow they survived at that time. 1993, we see a coalition with LDP losing its majority, a coalition party comes. And since 1993, what we are seeing in Japan is a trend, which is a coalition government in Japan, right? So even the LDP has been in coalition with the Komeito party for the last about 20 years. So this is quite an interesting trend in Japan. At the same time, we see the LDP being dominant. So the old LDP domination persists, but there is a trend for a coalition government. And also the LDP lost power in 2009.
Yes, but you could also argue that the LDP would love nothing better than to shake off the Komeito, because the Komeito is standing in the way of that great aspiration that usually attaches to Prime Minister Abe of revising the pacifist clause of the Constitution.
Yeah, well, that's.
But Kiichi, you know, is the opposition ever going to get its act together?
The opposition is pretty much focused on the Constitution. The Constitution is one issue that makes it easy confront the Abe administration in a straightforward manner. This also marginalizes the opposition as a possible governing party. And that's the dilemma we saw in the Japanese Socialist Party, and we're seeing that it's right now with Nikkei Minshuto. You're clear on Constitution, and that can grab considerable amount of votes.
But it's a problem of competence also.
That is true. And that's something that they've been struggling with right now. And about Komeito, and that's an excellent point. Abe wants to revise the Constitution, period, really. And that is his priority. And having said that, if you shake off Komeito, I'm not sure if LDP members of parliament would be happy, because they've become so dependent on vote mobilization from Soka Gakkai. So yes, Abe doesn't want Komeito to shake policy on defense matters. He certainly didn't like the way Komeito handled Anpo Hosei or the security laws. And Komeito, of course, is opposed to the revision of the Constitution. But at the same time, an LDP without Komeito is going to be pretty tough for first term, second term members of parliament. So that's a divisive issue.
That brings us to Abe, and isn't it true? And even the slides that we have behind us for this Japan update, it's all about Abe. And there's a lot written about Abe as a conviction nationalist politician, wants to revise the peace clause of the Constitution, etc., etc. But recently people have been pointing to several indications that Abe is sacrificing his ideology, and you might call his super ideological convictions, for the cause of pragmatism. And I'm going to especially bring that out when I talk to the panel about some bilateral relationships at the moment. But the indicator of this is the latest Blue Book. And newspaper articles have been written about this. Many things have been written about the great difference between the 2018 Blue Book and the 2019. Because all of a sudden, in 12 months between the Blue Books, the DPRK, Russia and China are referred to in rather nice, conciliatory and future-focused terms. Whereas you cannot say that at all about the way they were referred to in the 2018 version of the Blue Book. And Adam Liff, Tobias Harris, they're now saying Abe has become a pragmatist, and he has reduced his ideological ambition for constitutional revision to getting the self-defence forces recognised in the Constitution as a legal entity. Forget about all the rest of Article 9 being changed. And that is what he has reduced his ambition to. So, to what extent, panellists, do we think that it is all about Abe? And going back to Kiichi's presentation, there has been significant institutional change. Is that likely to survive Abe when he moves from the political stage? The National Security Council, the incredibly well-staffed Secretariat, the Cabinet Personnel Bureau, the centralisation of foreign and security policy authority and coordination into the Prime Minister's office. Why should that change when Abe leaves the stage, Kiichi? Do you think it will?
So the question, the question you raised about post-Abe, which is 2021, we are talking about.
In theory.
In theory, we have to be in theory.
We might do a quadruple
Yes, I mean, tomorrow,
Lazarus.
anything can happen in politics. 1 week is a long time in politics, as we know.
Yeah.
But let's think 2021, right? So post-Abe, what is the scenario? Who are the people who are going to replace Abe? In Japan, as most of you know, is still a strong hereditary politics, and even within the LDP. So I have counted there are 8 names always put forward as post-Abe leadership, right? And all of them are in the old LDP mode. Some might be a little bit more liberal, others might be more conservative. If you think about Ishiba, he wants to change Article 9, right? Totally, not like Abe. If you look at other politicians in the LDP, they might have a little bit liberal ideas. But there is no renewal of policy ideas in my view, right? So all these politicians have been in the LDP for such a long period of time, and they have been with Abe for such a long period of time. And we are now hearing younger generation of LDP politicians, right? So everyone is talking about Shinjiro Koizumi. And even there's talk that he might be in the next Abe cabinet is going to be shuffled soon. So my question is, whether we have got renewal in Japanese politics, and I can't see renewal.
Yeah, who needs renewal when you're on the winner?
And that's what, I mean, yes.
You're winning.
But you keep on doing the same old thing, right?
Yeah, it works.
So if it works, it works.
Well, coming back to this Abe, an ideological pragmatist question, Abe has been quite pragmatic in his second administration for the simple reason being that he wants to stay in power. And there's a remarkable difference between the first administration and the second administration. But nonetheless, there was consistency in taking China as the main threat. And that was common to both Abe 1 and Abe 2. And in Abe 2, since 2018, the point you discussed about this Blue Book is a significant change. And also, where North Korea seems to be dangerous when the American president thinks it's dangerous. When North Korea is not willing to work on long-range missiles and that endanger U.S. security, then somehow Japan seems to be happy with short-range missile that can reach Japan with nuclear warheads. So I don't want to be cynical, but it's quite difficult to take all these seriously, really.
It is hard to take it seriously,
yes.
and yet there's this pragmatic line radiating out of the Blue Book.
Although I would say that when it comes to his ideologies, I would think that he, Prime Minister Abe still remains a right-wing politician, especially when it comes to the definition of Japanese nation after the Second World War. And that has been under control in a way, because you visit Yasukuni and you're out, really. If you start something that rocks the history issue with China, it would challenge the legitimacy of the administration. However, observing the development of this dispute between ROK and Japan, I think I can say that this is still very much a nationalistic administration.
It is a nationalistic administration, but let's look at some counterexamples straight away. We heard from Kiichi's own mouth just a few minutes ago that things are going the right way with the Japan-China relations, especially from 2018. Now, Kiichi was suggesting this is ad hocery, it's not going to last. But can we contemplate that perhaps by moving in a more positive direction in its relationship with China, that Abe and Japan is creating some strategic space or distance even between Japan and the US as far as the China policy is concerned? What do you think?
Okay, so China-Japan relations has received a lot of attention, and many people get the impression that China-Japan relations is improving. But my question is, so in what field or at what front that Sino-Japan relations have improved? So the bilateral relations have been tightening since, I would say, 2014, when the first Xi Jinping-Abe summit was held at APEC. And then they met with each other constantly, and the Japanese government has promised to cooperate with BRI. So, but I would say that the improving relations between the two countries is really very symbolic. The only achievement coming out of this kind of improving political climate is they have working on the mechanism averting unintended military clashes between their forces in and above near water. I think that's the only achievement. But because if you look at the public opinion toward China, so constantly over 80% of Japanese people, they say they don't have affinity with China. And if you look at the Sengak Diaoyu Island issue, so the Chinese coastal armies constantly enter near the Sengak Diaoyu Island. So these kind of things have always been there, and the tension over the economic and political tensions have not been eased, first of all. And then about economic cooperation, well, the Japanese government has promised to work with BRI, but only on a case-by-case basis, right? So, and they qualified with 4 preconditions.
Okay.
Yeah. So currently, there's no one single project being cooperated by the two governments under the umbrella of BRI.
Are you willing to say, however grudgingly, that things are going in a more positive direction?
Yeah, maybe if without the trade war between China and the United States. Okay.
But we have the trade war, so what does this mean? Isn't Japan going to be squeezed by the US to also embrace a harder line towards China in the trade sphere?
Well, I think the several things we need to look very carefully. First of all, the US-Japan trade negotiation and whether the agreement will include the same clause like Mexico, Canada, U.S. agreement, which was being said that is targeted against China. And second, whether the U.S. is, how to say, they determined to decouple
Yes.
the economic relations with China or not, because, well, the Japanese government has adopted kind of engagement policy with China. Well, they adopt the containment policy against China in the security arena, but on the other hand, it promote, like using the government words, that's the functional economic cooperation with China. But if this kind of decoupling things go on, then it's really difficult for Japan to cooperate or continue this kind of engagement policy toward China.
Okay.
And that kind of the U.S. policy will actually shape the future direction of Sino-Japan relations.
Yes. So I'm going to cling to my line about pragmatism being evident. And Lauren, I just want to ask you about DPRK at this moment, because we'll come back to the ROK later. I don't think that's an example of pragmatism. But when we look at the DPRK, and Kiichi, you might chip in here as well. Abe and Japan has been utterly marginalised in all of the recent DPRK diplomacy. If Trump mentioned the words abductees during one of his meetings with Kim, I'm not sure how big a success we can call that. So do you think we're going to see some independent Abe diplomacy? Is he going to get his own bilateral with Kim? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think it's very unlikely. I would have to agree with Kiichi and also Tobias Harris in his East Asia Forum quarterly piece, where he says that, you know, Abe has often sacrificed, you know, his foreign policy goals and other goals for the sake of maintaining his power base. And I think that's the best way to understand his treatment of the DPRK, because I think Abe knows that if he was to take a chance on the DPRK and say, okay, let's have a summit, a denuclearization summit, Abe has to bring up the abduction issue. And he has to get something back from Kim on the abduction issue, or he'll suffer domestically. And he knows that what can Kim give him on the abduction issue? All he's going to say is
how about something in Japan's national interest?
Yeah.
How about, honestly, we have an example of security being outgunned by domestic popularity.
Yeah, it's quite astounding that, you know, Japan, especially under the Abe administration, has always put the abduction issue before the nuclear issue. Even though the abduction issue is essentially a historical issue. I mean, okay, maybe some of them are still alive, but the nuclear issue is a current issue, and Japan, having been victim of atomic bombs before, should know better than any other country what a serious threat that is, and to really put that at the forefront. So that again just speaks to, I think, how much he just wants to stay in power and appease his domestic constituencies.
At any cost.
At any cost.
Okay, we've gone away from pragmatism, so I'm clinging to it here now, Kiichi. Japan-US. We've heard about the bromance between Abe and Trump. There's a question of dividend versus detriment. There's an incredible list of detriment. First of all, being marginalised from DPRK diplomacy. There's TPP. Abe is leading, America is out. There's the Paris Accord. There's the tariffs and the threat of harsh terms on the next round of host nation support negotiations. The list is actually longer than that, but let's stop there for the detrimental aspects. Apart from the domestic political cachet of being a mate of Trump's, what has Abe got to show for actually going a long way to demean himself and subordinate himself in this romance.
Vicky, you're pushing me into a position to defend others. You're asking the wrong person, really. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that a list of difficulties, if not crises, in foreign policy or failures, has not worked against Abe's popularity.
No.
No. It's a puzzle, really, and I really don't have good answers to that. In one way, this is a prime minister who is successful in showing his face overseas, giving good talks, and he does deliver pretty well in Washington, Canberra, or London. I've heard him once in London. He did it pretty well. But that has little to do with actual policy achievements. What you can say is that without the bromance, U.S. could have been much harsher, much more troublesome to Japan, so Abe has worked in a way to somehow contain the Trump crisis. That would be the mainline argument that you would hear from Kazumi Gaseki. What would have happened if Abe worked in a way like Merkel,
Or Macron.
or Macron, and then we have crisis, major crisis. That doesn't mean that well, we have been successful in winning a policy that we wish from the United States at all.
And, you know, isn't there still a prospect of tariffs being imposed on Japanese cars? Will that be the point where domestic credibility is stretched?
I doubt it.
You doubt it?
I doubt it. As a matter of fact, no, this is an interesting point. Take a look at the trade policy, reaction to trade policy in the United States. And you see support for trade regulations and tariff among the Democrats as well. Support for, well, if I may say, protectionist measures. It's actually quite bipartisan.
So the move away from liberal internationalism is actually going to its opposite.
And this is not a place to discuss about this, but this is my fear, that liberal internationalism always had a democracy deficit. This was more about, intellectuals, liberals, elites, but with limited support from domestic public opinion. Middle of the road, elitist, this position is now being
Discredited?
discredited, yes. And that is something I see. When it comes to unprofessionalism in Abe's foreign policy, I have very strong words. I use very strong words, but that has not attracted much attention from Japanese media at all. Really.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm talking like a bureaucrat.
You're all right, Keiichi.
Well, thank you.
You're okay.
But somehow this relationship between support from the civil society for a more liberal international institution, this nexus might be weaker than we assumed.
Yeah, there's a lot of hums and nods with you, Keiichi. I think the pragmatism idea is being shot down, and Adam Liff is going to have to retract a couple of his recent articles where he argues this, and we'll have to get on to Tobias about his article because really we haven't found evidence yet for the pragmatism direction behind Abe, the Abe administration's foreign and security policy. And yeah, I was going to juxtapose at this point and say that we have one glaring exception of a departure from pragmatism, being Japan ROK, Lauren. Now we have harsh words, including from you, in your article, where you say there is no clear way out of this impasse. Your words. John Nelson Wright. Something seems to have snapped between Japan and the ROK. Now, this is feeling very serious. It feels like national identity politics coming out of every nook and cranny in both countries. What is driving it? Can you shed some light on it for us?
How much time have we got? 1 hour. Yeah, so obviously there's no pragmatism here on either side. I think it's very clear that there's no winners in this dispute. Both countries are going to suffer a lot economically, security-wise, diplomacy-wise. The relationship's taken a real hit. So I don't want to discuss, all these current disputes you see going on, because I'm sure you've all heard about them, the trade wars and court cases and things like that. But I would like to say that I think in understanding what's going on, we can't find a solution. We can't find the cause by looking at the current disputes. I would say that all of these disputes are just an effect of a much deeper struggle, and this is where the cause lies. I think the reason we have so much trouble understanding Japan-ROK relations, especially the history problems in the post-Cold War period, how they've played out, is because we have the level of analysis wrong. And I think it's not, I don't see it as identity disputes or really national disputes. I think we can't understand these disputes as a Japan versus Korea problem, or in like a national framework. From all the fieldwork I've done on these issues, especially concerning Korean victims, and they're the ones, the comfort women, the forced laborers, they're the ones really at the forefront of what's going on here. And really these disputes can only be understood as a struggle between the individual and the state. And when I say the state, I'm not talking about Japan versus them, I'm talking about the Japanese and Korean government versus the Korean victims and many left-wing activists in Japan who've been supporting them in their struggle for decades. And this struggle obviously stems from the fact that the two governments, a lot of Koreans suffered under colonialism terribly, especially these categories of victims that we see dominating today, and also the Korean atomic bomb victims who don't really get a voice, and that's a whole other story. But, the two governments tried to resolve their problems in 1965. They signed a treaty, waived all of their rights. The problem was that these victims didn't support that treaty, they didn't support that settlement.
Well, they weren't consulted.
Exactly. So they had no choice. The only category of victim that was negotiated specifically was the forced laborers. And I think this is partly why Japan's so emotional today. We solved that issue with you. Now you're just throwing that up in the air. But the problem was many analysts are drawing, this treaty as the source of today's problems. But I would say that's the foundation.